fasting, which is really just, listening to the body. There's a reason, like it's been such a pinnacle, a part of so many different spiritual traditions, including, Jesus, 40 days, 40 nights. He fasted, and it's such a key to our own spiritual, but also physical development. As you mentioned, if we can just kind of let go, push aside all those poisons that are kind of offending our body and impeding its healing and its progress, it's like, just stop. Right? As you mentioned, I mean, any kind of metabolic disorder somebody's dealing with, like, start fasting, right? The body will begin to heal.
Welcome to the Consciousness of the Way. I am your humble servant and seafood Taoist Master San Qing, and it is Christmas morning once more. I come down to the tree. The universe has brought me this incredible being. Yes, you've heard it before. I'm not tired of it. I'm going to keep introducing people this way because it is like Christmas for me. So I want to welcome to the podcast today Malcolm from Light Cellar. And he is a visionary, a creator, a conscious creator, a seeker, and all things in between, great insight and mastery into many things in relation to nutrition and herbology. Welcome to the podcast today, my dear friend.
All right. Thank you. So excited to be on, and it's an honor, and I look forward to where our conversation will go and in serving those who are listening.
Yes, yes. So why don't we start off with just a little snippet about where you've come from and how you got here today.
Okay, well, my response could be long because I do like to go off on tangents, and you just shared with me before we started that your world record podcast, 7.5 hours. We won't go that long, but I could go on a bit of a monologue here. So, I was born and raised in Calgary, and just like most people, suburban northwest part of the city. And I guess a big shift, a big turning in terms of my consciousness as it specifically relates to food, which I'll emphasize, for me is a real foundation, right? I really kind of bought into that idea of you are what you eat, and I didn't want to be junk food anymore. In that sense, like raised on standard American diet. I've got a brother, he's 2 years older. Him and I, we love junk food. We love fast food. And, for me, up until that point, food was whatever was quick, easy, and tasted good. And then at 16, the time of your life when you're supposed to have all your youth and all your energy, I could barely make it through a day. I was tired all the time. I had blood sugar issues. And in fact, it was the result of a very intentional decision that I had made. I'd been thinking about it for a while. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unlike any other. I was coming home. It's like, all right, this is it. I'm going to do it. And so I came in the house and I had this announcement to make to my mom. And, she was preparing dinner very lovingly, as she always did. I could smell the chocolate chip cookies cooling on the counter. And I says, Mom, I'm going to become a vegetarian. Oh, you're still going to eat this supper, aren't you? And so she's Scottish. And so the type of food that she did prepare was meat and potatoes. Like I mentioned, I love packaged food, junk food, that type of thing. And it might surprise you that, I kind of took this turn overnight where I went from meat, potatoes, and junk food to just potatoes and junk food. And it didn't go so well. But it was kind of a wake-up call to, oh, okay, there must be something more to food. Now, there's two things I got to caveat really quickly here. That decision led me on my journey, my path to where I am today. For more than 10 years, almost 15 years, I adhered to being a vegetarian. I explored every iteration, every aspect of it, and then eventually came to other conclusions, and we can talk about that. I've kind of given up all diets, all dogma. I'm much more about following my gut more than nutrition trends. And that initial inspiration that inspired me to go vegetarian had nothing to do with food or nutrition. It was primarily kind of environmentally inspired. Part of my upbringing was with a deep connection to nature. Though we didn't call it that, I can look back and say, you know what, that was our church. I was raised with, more or less atheist parents. And again, but they didn't even have that title. It was just like church and religion and God just weren't a part of their life, but nature was. And we spent a lot of time out of nature. And growing up in suburban Northwest Calgary, we had moved to a new community earlier on in those years. And, what I would do, like in my spare time, time and hanging out with friends. We would just go like roam the hills, and slowly we saw all those hills, get ripped up, turned into development. And among other things, David Suzuki was an early inspiration, where he defined modern economics as a severe form of brain damage, with its constant kind of drive of growth on a finite planet. Anyways, my views have matured a lot since then, but there's still a prevalent narrative about if we want to be environmental, if we want to save the world, we got to be plant-based, we got to be vegetarian, and very simply, that's a myth. In fact, one of the turning points for me many years later was reading a book called The Vegetarian Myth, a woman named Liera Keith, and I'll just kind of put it right down into one phrase: it's not the cow, it's how. And whether it's a plant food or an animal food, we can't say one is good and one is bad, right? The world is not that black and white, although I liked at one point in my life to put things in black and white. Alcohol is bad, tobacco is bad, meat is bad, these types of things. But hey, it's a journey. We grow, we evolve, we mature. And I feel I have a very healthy, physical body, as well as relationship to food. And that has been a main driving force about, who I am today, how I show up in the world, and what I'm sharing. I would love to empower anybody on that path. I mean, because let's face it, food and nutrition, our most basic of needs, has become so confusing, shall we say, right? I personally was very lost, and I see a lot of others trying to navigate through that world. We have the voices of government, we have the voices of industry, we have all these influences, trying to inform us on how to eat. But I would say that their interests and their are maybe not aligned with what is ideal. So I've got a lot to share through this conversation that I will hope will, quickly, easily, it won't take you 10, 15 years as it did for me to try and figure it out. I've done a lot of formal training. I do have, certificates and degrees, but I've also primarily, I really want to emphasize, this has just been my own personal journey, my own passion that has turned into a vocation. I've built a store and a business around this, but it is on its basis simple. So I want to talk about being your own nutritionist, that you don't need a degree to figure out how to feed yourself, that one can rely on simple basic intelligence. We'll get into an acronym I called Food Scope, which I see as a lens which will help anybody look at any food, any diet, and know if it's right for them. In this conversation, I'd love to bring in the idea of being your own herbalist, and how the plant path and the world of herbs offers us, as it has been throughout time, every single culture around the world has this inherent intelligence, cultural wisdom about utilizing plant medicine as kind of a base form of self-care. Now, this isn't to replace modern medicine or be against modern medicine. It's about empowering yourself with just fundamental basic knowledge that humans have held throughout time. Again, regardless of where anybody lived, there was a diet, and there was kind of a methodology, shall we say, of utilizing plant medicine to care for oneself. And I see this fundamentally, as I started off, being kind of a keystone to our own development, personally, individually, but in our collective and our own consciousness, as well as who we are physically. And if we can align that, so much of what we see today, the issues in our world, would actually be resolved. I mean, we don't have to get into the last 4 years, but let me just tell you, the path would have been very different if we had each taken personal responsibility for our own health, if we'd been in line with having a strong temple, a physical temple, and if we had pursued other means that were less costly, less damaging, and more empowering, i.e. plant medicine, the results would have been very different. So that's just a really quick kind of high level overview of hopefully what we're going to talk about and set some foundation. So I'll kind of let you steer the conversation from there.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been surrounded by consciously probably for the last 40 years. So, within Taoist practices, one of the highest levels of developmental connection with the physicality of the humanist that is represented as your physical body that you believe is your flesh and blood comes from being a maestro, a master of the alchemical processes within that. And first and foremost is what we call resting. And the highest level of knowing is, sustenance to this physicality. And when you are in the flow, one meal every second day is optimal. That is when you're at your highest point of realization. Now, that's a developmental skill that comes with, mental, emotional, physical transformation. And it comes from, that seeker coming to that journey using the ancient practices that we cultivate to get there, because you'll have more energy than you've ever had before in your life, and you'll be like, holy crap, this doesn't even make any sense, contradictory to the Western model of complete decimation and deconstructing of your own mitochondria through basically a psyop of mind melting manipulation that gives you an idea of how you should really conduct nutrition or sustenance in your life on a daily basis. But regressing back to like 40 years ago when I started on my journey as a bodybuilder and a power lifter, I learned about nutrition very quickly at the young old age of 11. And then I integrated it deeply into a competitive sort of like position where I recommended to everyone to regenerate, shed the fat cell storage within your physical body at least once in a lifetime. Being at 3 or 4% was problematic in of itself, but that was part of the journey of a bodybuilder and powerlifter, was getting to that low body fat percentage. I will tell you, it feels superhuman when you get to that low rate, and you can't sustain it. The homeostasis is just not possible. Yet when you get there, you shed your body of this toxic garbage that you've been accumulating over time that puts you in the state. Now, back then I was eating one meal a day and my strength went up. I want to also demystify and have a conversation with you about this. I'm going to say it personality wise, the nonsense about 1 pound of protein per 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight nonsense that's been going on since I was a young boy. Back in those days, 40 years ago, they were peddling that nonsense, and they're still doing it today. You can build an excessive amount of muscle tissue on 1 meal a day and exercising. And I always keep people between 60 to 100 grams max. I don't care who it is. That's really hitting a high threshold. Now, I would love you to share how you perceive that, but I'm pretty sure you're going to have probably a similar conclusion. And I would love to hear your answer to that very question. So why don't we start with this myth of this, I think it's what we call self-evident renal failure. But hey, please go ahead.
For sure. Yeah. Actually, I was recently talking to a neighbor friend who was faced with that very prospect. He went and see a functional medicine doctor who prescribed him, 1 gram of protein per body weight. And he's like, what? Like, how do I do that? Like, that just seems impossible. I mean, he's not a big guy, but still he was looking at like 160, 170 grams of protein per day. Yeah. It's along the same lines of like, oh, you got to drink 8 glasses of water per day. Like, really? Are you serious? Like, who does that? And when you try, to force these kind of theoretical, constructs onto the body, the body will push back. You can take it for so long, so far, and that's why I'm really against, or I just have dropped this idea of like, the kind of the nutrition trends. As much as I like some of these theories, some of them are actually rooted in something, can achieve tangible results. A lot of them not, and our bodies are the ultimate, self-healing, self-repairing, self-regenerating. I don't want to call them machines, like miracles. They're absolute miracle. And if we can just tune in, if we can begin to learn the language of the body and begin to work with it and marvel at it and give it what it wants. Challenge is we haven't been taught that, right? We've been taught this other kind of model, and we haven't developed that relationship with our body. And especially the foods that we're consuming as well have contributed to that, right? They're far too high in calories, far too low in nutrients, and it keeps us on this cycle with this kind of evolutionary, base instincts of, craving after sugars, craving after salts, craving after fats. And when you get things that are empty or they're exaggerated, then they have chemicals, it begins to confuse the body even more. So I'm not sure if you were getting at this idea, and I get the sense that you've done fasting, right? Sounds like even just periodically, one meal every day or one meal every 2 days.
We call it resting within Taoism, but I've been doing that since I was 11. And that self-preservation is the biggest reset and realization of healing that you've ever seen in your life. If you did nothing else, listening to this conversation here, didn't hear another thing, that will realize any metabolic disorder nonsense that keeps coming up with something in the ballpark of an autoimmune. All of this is constructed from toxicity that has been manipulated within the Western world, that polluting perfection through drugs, supplements, food, decisions that are 99% the reason you are looking at mortality at an epidemic rate of speed, and that the timeline of the average person is getting shorter is due to that very fact. Not a lengthening, which it should be, but something as simple as genetic expression, opening up the mTOR pathway and realizing that excessive amounts of protein, i.e. branched chain amino acid, burns your candle so much faster. And so people don't even, there's so many deeper understandings. I mean, I think between you and I, the wordsmithing is the stuff that confuses people because, lest we forget. You ever heard that expression? Yeah. Okay. So, you come to the 90s and you have this genius idea that you look at, someone like P. Diddy or Vanilla Ice as profound, prodigies of musical composition, when they're just really just people regurgitating stuff that's already been created by a master 10 or 20 years ago. This is the subject of the human condition when it comes to food.
Yeah.
It's like, we forget it. Whoa, hang on. If Atkins' diet was so good, packaged back in the 70s, why did the guy die from a massive heart attack? What gives? I don't know. But now it's a keto. It's a paleo. How fast are you going to burn this stuff out? It's a South Beach diet. It's a diet of some kind, which is cornholing you into a self-evident destruction of your very physical body. And so, we go over these cycles of, I need to, diet. It's also the salt myth. The only reason you have to be concerned about salt is because you've altered the chemistry within your body due to other decisions that you've made. More often, mostly, the metabolic disorder that is the epic proportions of all things is insulin resistance. And that comes from just decisions you've made and the chemical crap that's in everything that is attempting to kill you. I'm just saying. I'm sorry. I need to take a deep breath, and I'll just step back. And I love your insight into how you see things.
Yeah, totally. And when we look at the rest of society, like there's this idea of, normal, right? And it's like, just because that's normal doesn't mean it's actually normal, or shall we say optimal. And there are examples, throughout society, typically kind of on the fringes, where you're like, okay, this person actually really knows something, and they're maybe pushing the upper limits of what's possible within our societal framework and context. But I guarantee you, if we all got to that level, there'd be somebody else that would be, that much higher and further. One interesting little tidbit I came across was that, most species, an observation of, life across all different species, is that, the kind of the life expectancy is 10 times the age to maturity. Okay, so in our society, that would put us at about 180 years. And okay, maybe we, kind of coddle our children a little bit longer. In previous times in history, you hear about, it might have been 12 or it might have been 14, was considered, an ability to kind of mature. And then you think, okay, well, biologically, supposedly the prefrontal cortex doesn't really truly develop until the mid-20s. So maybe that can be the marker. But anyway, you take it, it's just like we are not living to our full potential. And yet we just kind of accept that as just normal. And all cultural diets are good diets, except for the standard American diet, and so that was one of my kind of, threads, back to, okay, that along with fasting, which is really just, listening to the body. There's a reason, like it's been such a pinnacle, a part of so many different spiritual traditions, including, Jesus, 40 days, 40 nights, he fasted, and is such a key to our own spiritual, but also physical development. As you mentioned, if we can just kind of let go, push aside all those poisons that are kind of offending our body and impeding its healing and its progress, it's like, just stop, right? As you mentioned, I mean, any kind of metabolic disorder somebody's dealing with, like, start fasting, right? The body will begin to heal. And then maybe there are certain kind of herbs or elements that one can bring in to support that. But fundamentally, you get to experience, as you had shared, when you kind of get on a new metabolic program of like what the body is possible with. And there's that great saying that any fool can fast, but only a wise man knows how to break it. And it's that challenge of breaking the fast. And I played this with this for years. It's like, okay, I feel amazing, when I'm fasting. And this, as soon as I bring food in, it was like, like something would shift. It's like, okay, how do I eat in a way that maintains that level of, heightened awareness and, kind of peak physical health? Because obviously, we're in this physical realm. We do need food. Maybe that's a potential that, more advanced masters can do without. It's certainly not me. I've tried in that sense. And I think we are here to have that human physical experience, and food is a part of it. So how do we get straight to kind of the heart of it, the purity of it? In cultures, whether it's your own ancestral culture or one that you're kind of, engaged in, philosophically for another reason, like Taoism or Ayurveda, right? One can look to those traditions for guidance. It's just our standard American, modern culture that's gotten so far off track that we use as a baseline and a reference point because we're immersed in it. But we have to, resist that and come back to more deeply grounded traditions that, let's be honest, if it wasn't a good cultural diet, we wouldn't be here. And we're beginning to see the effects of that, of the modern culture. There's a study called the Pottinger cat experiment, which this man kind of played out on cats. But the parallel is also playing out in humans, where each successive generation, because of deficiencies in the diet, eating wrong foods, successive generations become weaker. And we have become degenerated. We're degenerative as a society, as a species. You mentioned music. I think about that all the time. It's like, our pop music, our pop culture, right? It's junk food, it's fast food in that sense. Like if we look back to the classics, whether it is music, whether it's art, whether it's literature, it's like, oh my gosh, like it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's complex, it's actual mastery versus excuse my language, but this like the crap that is like spewed out and held in such high regard, by the masses. It's like, wow, how far from the truth could we be?
Yeah, I mean, it's like an attack on your psyche, which puts you in a tailspin, because it delves deep into your unconscious. When you're emotional, you're suggestible. And when you're suggestible and you're emotional, you're unconscious. That's just the plain brass tacks.
Right.
As my great grandmother would say, the brass tacks. And people are like, what is a brass tack? Well, it was what the immigrants were given when they come over from other countries. They were handed these things as a form of an identifying and sort of like a currency, which I found really interesting. So that's where the expression comes from. But I get my grandmother right now going, it's brass tack. It's not tax. You say tax. It's not correct. It's incorrect. It works for me. All right.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, you bring up an interesting point, and I'll just mention it. We won't go down this rabbit hole, but this idea of currency, because that's another thing that's been so corrupted. Our financial or economic, like monetary systems are so corrupt and bastardized. People are wondering, like, what's going on with inflation and cost of living? And it's like, because we're being scammed, right? The idea of sound money, this relates to what I thought of when you said, the brass tack, right? Sound money related to the sound of a gold coin, which is a hard money, which can't be easily replicated like they're doing today, where they're just like, digits on a screen creating as much as they want. And whoever gets that first, i.e. whoever's closest to the creation of this new currency, gets to spend it before it dilutes the currency supply. So I'm very much interested in sound money as well, in terms of that, of what is real and what has integrity. So that's another topic for another time. But let me introduce this idea of the food scope, a lens. So like I mentioned, it's an acronym. So SCOPE. So you look through these lenses and you'll be able to tell, what any food, any diet that's right for you. And the key is that you can't just have one of each of these lenses. It's kind of bringing them all together. So S stands for science, pretty obvious, right? Like food, nutrition, science. Science is great. It's wonderful. However, there are some things that we need to be aware of, that it's still very new. Like, how long ago did we discover vitamin C, and what will kind of be on the forefront next? If someone follows this, you'll always see, of course, there are, more breakthroughs and understanding from the scientific level about food nutrition. What are the nutrients in foods? How does it affect our body and our longevity, so on and so forth. But, I think what we often fail to see, science really, its goal is to kind of one variable at a time, right? To control and then test and experiment. But we often don't really go deeper into the science. Like, well, who were they testing? Who were they? What were their lifestyles? Like, it's very, very hard to control one variable at a time. And like I say, when we have a society that's mostly, unhealthy, how much does that relate to oneself? So we obviously don't want to do away with science, but we also don't want to put it so much on a pedestal that, we put the blinders on to all these other beautiful ways of knowing. And science reflects one way of knowing, kind of that rational, logical, thought process, but there's also more that innate, intuitive sense of knowing, and both are equal and both are valuable. So next to the acronym, we have science, then we have culture. This is the C in the scope. I mentioned a little bit about that. And, if I were to only choose one lens through which to eat, I would actually choose culture. Culture has more to teach us, inform us, than definitely government, than definitely industry, and definitely science, which is often funded and influenced by industry to present what it wants to show. So every traditional cultural diet is a good diet. And I'm really into the work of someone named Dr. Weston A. Price, who was a dentist in the early 1900s, who, studied this link between food and nutrition, specifically in indigenous cultures, who he saw had an incredible level of health. What we mentioned before, what I think is possible as the potential of, true human health as other animals. You can see this with pets, through the domestication, as we bring pets into our realm close to us, so they begin to live our lifestyle and eat the foods that we eat. Or even in zoos, right? They are kind of an inferior species compared to their wild counterpart. We can even look at plants and how we domesticate plants, and they too become inferior to their wild domestic counterpart. And just a really quick example, if you're trying to wrap your head around that, is the idea of like a dandelion, right? Like, people go to extreme lengths to spray them, eradicate them, get rid of them. And guess what? Boom, 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 boom. They just keep popping up. They've got such a genetic strength and resilience to them compared to the tomato or the lettuce, and I'm not trashing those. I'm just saying, they need coddled. They need very specific conditions. They need fertilized, and they need watered, and they need this and that, where, plants that have a more wild genetic, they've got a strength and a resilience. Same with a wolf compared to a lapdog. And, humans have become this more degraded, domesticated version compared to our wild counterpart. And Dr. Weston A. Price was in a very unique point in time where he began to study indigenous peoples all around the world. So this was in Africa, this was in northern Canada, this was in Scotland, just as, trade routes and industrialization began to really open up the world. And so there was, people that were still living their traditional ways, eating their traditional diets, where suddenly modern industrial foods came to meet them. Or from those communities, people left and went to the cities to work and adapted a new lifestyle. And you've heard that phrase, never look a gift horse in the mouth. Well, that's because you can tell so much about the health of an animal, including humans, by just looking at their teeth. And I count myself exactly in this category. I did a conference recently, and there was about 150 people in the room. And I says, by a show of hands, how many of you have never had a cavity, never had braces, never had any sort of orthodontic, dentistry operation? And literally at 150, there was 2, right? And I'm in that 148, right? Like, I was the kid with all the cavities growing up. Like, is that normal? Sure, it's normal, but it's definitely not natural. And so he was able to showcase how, indigenous people eating traditional foods, they weren't plagued with these kinds of things. They actually enjoyed really good, robust health. They didn't have problems reproducing. They didn't, have dental deformities. But guess what? As soon as someone moved away from that community, or certain individuals in the community started, bringing in the processed industrialized foods, the seed oils, they stopped eating traditional foods like organ meat, so on and so forth. And he outlined, 11 principles that are common threads to each traditional cultural diet. That's when the problems started showing up. So that's a huge, incredible piece of work that we can rely on and look to culture for this piece. Now, the one thing we got to keep in mind about culture, they weren't perfect. Could it be improved? They were limited by, space and time and their own knowledge. So absolutely, we can improve upon it, but it's an amazing foundation, at least to kind of begin with on your journey. So we have science, we have culture. The next in the acronym is the O, which I've defined in different ways, but maybe the best way to put it would be, observations of others. At least this is how we come to it, right? So I might, meet you on the street and go, oh my gosh, or watch your podcast and this guy's got some health, he's got some vitality, right? What are you doing, right? I'm going to look to you because you're farther down the path. You certainly know something about health and bodybuilding and strength and awareness that, I'm clearly missing. And if I'm honest and reflect on that, I can then be inspired by others. And this is how we are. We're socially wired. This is why marketing uses, people like Wayne Gretzky. It's like, I love breakfast cereals because, Wayne Gretzky's on the cover and I'm going to eat them too. If he eats his Wheaties, then, I got to eat my Wheaties too. We're hardwired that way. And unfortunately, we can be taken advantage of that. But in its fundamentalness, our learning comes through the observation of others, not only other people, but as we talk about, herbalism, how did ancient cultures know what they know? Well, there's a big answer to that. But one part of that answers that question, was observing, right? Observing others. So you might know about cordyceps. This is one of the kind of great famed medicinal mushrooms. And humans now, through science, as well as cultural wisdom and understanding, and through experience, we know a lot about cordyceps mushrooms and how it kind of affects and acts in the body. I don't want to say it's a myth, but maybe a legend of how did we first kind of come upon this knowledge? It was yak herders, who would take their yaks up to the high elevations to graze. And at a certain time of year, they would get really frisky. And, so it is said that they were eating the cordyceps, which would have a very positive effect on them. And the yak herders like, ooh, ooh, I want some of that. You know, it's very similar to the story of a Chinese herb called epimedium, which is affectionately known as horny goat weed. Again, the goat hoarders would take the goats out to pasture, and there was this one particular plant that they would just eat and then just get really frisky, right? Horny goat weed. Humans are like, oh, okay, well, if it does that to the goats, you know, let me give it a try, kind of thing. So observation is a very powerful way that we can come to knowledge and begin to test and experiment on ourselves. And then ultimately it relies on this last two, P and E, which is personal experience. You know, how does it work for you? How do you feel? What are the results that you're getting, you know, based upon, you know, science, culture, observations of others? Because yeah, that's where the rubber hits the road. People can be doing this and that and saying this things about it, and science could validate, and yeah, it's culturally, you know, seems to be backed and appropriate. But if it doesn't work for you, if you need to shift or modify, you know, that is the most important. And yet, of course, we can't, you know, deny the other three lenses of just like, well, you know, I give the example of like somebody who's mushroom foraging. He's like, yeah, you know, personal experience, right? It's like, let me try this, you know, I'll tell you if this is good or not, right? Eats it. Well, that's kind of a dumb way to to go about it. But you know, at its foundation, it's each of those lenses brought together.
Yeah, experiential, self-evident is really the way to go. Understanding that, you know, your tuning fork, the physicality will accumulate. It's such a profound soft technology, more advanced than anything you'll ever perceive or come in contact with in this reality ever, including AI of any generation of AI, is not going to come close to the technology you already possess. So now it's kind of like adapting to that and understanding it, how quickly it has a profound effect. I mean, 40 years ago, there were 20 odd amino acids, were basically the cycling of what would be a profile of a supplement based sort of offering in society today. It's the same 20 odd amino acids transmuted into variants that have been manipulated very much like a GMO sort of like status. And, you know, most people are like, oh, well, I'm plant-based, I'm vegan, I'm vegetarian, and I'm just going to take this pea protein and blah, 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 blah. Yet it's a bright byproduct, like just branched chain amino acids. If you're not getting fermented branched chain amino acids, then it's not plant-derived aminos. That means that things like leucine, for example, point and check, comes directly from duck feathers. Most of the amino acids are all byproducts of animal byproducts. Right. Some mutant transmitted offering that has been sort of translated in a larger scope from, say, China as origin, and then it comes into the supplemental world, and people put together all these offerings of what they think it is, yet it's originally from an animal byproduct. It's never from a plant itself, which, when you look at the hierarchy of evolution for any seeker of consciousness, it starts with the matter, chi, shen being spirit, wu ji, stillness, and then ultimately the mother of all things, the Tao. But when we get down to matter, we're speaking on that. The animals are consuming this stuff, which is from the earth, and then you're consuming them with other added bonuses, which become problematic and poisonous to you. And I agree with you when it comes to supplementing. It's a cycle of things. Culture or indigenous cultures generally have a staple that is most likely something that is more a larger offering of a carbohydrate of some kind, and there's smattering of other condiments that are enriching the expression of that, because it's a source of energy, being that we are naturally inclined to have more receptors that are related to consuming that very profile, a carbohydrate based type of food. That's just how it is. Yet you can access ketosis and use other forms of energy. It's what works best for you. But ultimately, you know, billions of Chinese have been eating rice for billions of years. Let's just say, okay, 10,000, 100,000, whatever. Yeah. And others until they got their little Ronald McDonald to come and say hello back in the 80s, they didn't have an issue with diabetes or insulin resistance or anything of that nature. And they ate 5 cups of rice on a daily basis. Yet they had this smattering of their, more potentially concentrated or over, you would not eat protein every meal like some American diet the way it is. They would have a little piece of fish once a week or a bit of beef here or there or whatever, but they were not like pounding themselves with this toxic offering, which
Totally.
was the diet. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think, I want to introduce what I call the 4 food groups. And these aren't the ones that you learned in school or that, the Canadian curriculum offers in grade 2, which are an absolute abysmal, failure to us. And, definitely I agree. Like if you look at nature, right, any kind of carnivore or animal that consumes animal foods, right? Let's take a lion, like classic example, takes down a zebra, eats and then chills, right? It's good. It's good for a while. It's not like zebra. It's just like, boom, take one down. Now we're going to rest. We're going to chill out. And then herbivore, it's like they're constantly grazing, constantly need to be eating. I truly believe we are omnivores. And again, if we look at, human history, every single traditional culture around the world actually consumes 4 food groups. It's not so hard. So there are plants, there are animals, there are bacteria, and there are fungi. That's the 4 food groups. That's what we consume. And I'll often kind of put this out to groups, if I'm speaking at a conference or something, I'm like, okay, just think about everything you put into your body, as a real food, not what Michael Pollan, New York Times food writer, would describe as edible food-like substances. So not petroleum derived and this and that. Like, is there anything outside of those 4 food groups that you consume that could be something else? And, the odd, kind of, sharp person might say, okay, well, what about salt? Like minerals. Yes, you are correct. So in fact, there is a 5th food group. There's always that 5th sacred thing. And these are the elements. So more kind of fundamentally, foundationally, we have earth, air, fire, water. Our most vital of nutrients is air, right? It's chi, it's prana. We can't live without it. Well, we can go maybe a few minutes. I heard the latest world record was 22.5 minutes without breathing. Unbelievable.
I mean, that's a world record. Personally, David Blaine has hit 40.
Wow.
I've personally hit 27, and that's called what we call embryonic breathing. You're breathing from consciousness. It's a developmental primordial practices within Taoism.
Right.
And once you breathe from that, you're not using the physicality anymore. It's
cool.
But yeah, so 22 is a myth. I personally hold the 27-minute hold. So really,
yeah, I mean, that's a great example of what we're talking about before. Like humans have become so degenerative that, like, okay, 22, but, here you are kind of on a fringe saying, yeah, 25, 27, 40, like no problem, right? Our human potential is so much more than within this frame of what we call normal. But, air, oxygen, prana, everything that includes. Obviously, it's such a vital nutrient, water being the second most vital nutrient. And let me just emphasize, how your body knows. Intuitive eating. You can qualitatively tell the difference between, these fundamental elements. So let's say, you're in the city, it's, you're downtown, it's rush hour, you're on a train or a bus, and it's like you're kind of packed in there. How are you breathing? Right? Like you're not thinking about it. It's like instinctively it's more shallow breathing versus you're outside, you're on the beach, you're in a forest, it's after a rainstorm. Oh my gosh, right? Instinctively, your body just wants to take that in. Your body knows exactly what is good and will reflectively, instinctively respond in a positive way. Water is another element. Fresh spring water straight from the ground. Unbelievable, right? Like unprocessed, unfiltered. You find the right spot. It's amazing. Of course, and then there's varying degrees of water. I live in Calgary, Alberta, which, I'm grateful for as a huge municipality. Like we have amazing water and I still want to filter it, because I have a sense of how much better it could be. And I used to not even touch, tap water, filtered water, just purely just drink, from springs, direct from the source. And I've got some really good filter systems that I'm comfortable with, and there's a practicality to that. But it took going to places like Florida or London, England, or Los Angeles, and you realize, like, wow, the level of quality of water we have here in Canada is amazing, and I'm really grateful for that. And I still try and filter it. So moving on, the other elements, we got fire, right? And even that, which is, I guess, obviously the element of heat, but most represented by the sun. And we know how much of an essential nutrient that is, despite, being told to stay out of the sun. And yeah, you mentioned it. Now we have to supplement, vitamin D, which comes synthesized from sheep lanolin, like how unnatural is that versus why don't we just get out in the sun and get healthy doses directly.
Direct source solar plexus. You want to, from a Taoist perspective, I mean, you're speaking on all the alchemical processes that would be more materialistic, but on an energetic profile, that's the source of all things. It's like you go back to the source of the animals eating the plants. The energy is the source of the material that you're offering, that you're embodying and infusing and turning it back into energy. So it's all a part of energy. It's where are you at and at what stage is it being developed? But the alchemical processes, I mean, we transmute that, and the human body is a battery. And you, as a Taoist alchemist, and within the practices, you develop skills to raise or maximize that battery. Your constitution, your Jing, you're born into this world with your hereditary genetic potential, disposition, however you want to put it, your ancestral profile is just a baseline. And so I've never seen anyone come in at 100%. They're always at about, if you look at a battery, you visualize this as you come in about 80% of your potential. And then through the alchemical processes, we bring you up to 100, then from 100 to 1,000, from 1,000 to as much as you want. Then you start to be able to realize that your physical potential is never to be tapped into, that you tap into direct source. And so as a light worker, a healer, a nutritionist, a herbologist, whatever, most people tend to be distracted by the humanistic perception, and they drain their life force. And what's the self-evident realization of that? Oh, man, I've had a long day. It's exhausting. Oh, I worked so hard. You are literally trickling your life force into whatever it is that you're doing, instead of realizing that it's never ending and that you tap into that potential from the now moment. And then the alchemical process is being able to really embody it, to saturate the 50 trillion cells that are basically 0.07 millivolts of electricity potential. Now, when you combine those and you're able to maestro that, we are off to the races, my friend.
Yeah, no, I love the image and the sensation I'm getting just envisioning that. Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, your energetic potential is very high. Your lung channel is super crystalline clear. And from a human perspective, that means that your energetic sensitivity is very high. I can breathe on you and you're going to feel it from here. And that's part of nurturing the physicality. And by doing that, the potential is realized, and it then gets stored in emotions, virtue sort of processes within a Taoist practice. So it's a visceral experience. And so you tap in. And that's why your third eye is a little buzzy right now, and you're admitting that into the space that you're in. How do I know this? Because first I see it, then I feel it, and that's just part of the practices that I cultivate and train in.
Cool. Right on. Well, maybe you can add to the fourth element, which is Earth, right? And this idea that, scientifically, it's these free electrons that we get. It's what we term grounding. It's why we feel so good, barefoot on the beach or even taking a shower. That's where most people will get that experience of being grounded each day. Otherwise, we're disconnected. And not only are we disconnected, but we're amongst all kinds of electromagnetic pollution and cell phones and electricity that will mess with our own body's frequency. And the earth is one of the quickest, easiest ways to kind of recalibrate and receive that direct energy. Not only that, but then the eating of earth, this idea of geophagy. So that is salts, of course, but it's also clays. Many species consume clay, and it plays a functional role in our diet. It's able to kind of adsorb onto toxins, especially that might be in plant foods. Birds will specifically eat clay along with all the seeds that they're eating to be able to mitigate the plant chemistry, which is simply just a defense mechanism, right? Animals, their defense mechanism is their ability to, locomotion, to run, to hide, to, attack, to defend itself. Plants, they do it through chemistry. I used to think, processing was a dirty word, right? Processed food, like who wants to eat that? But of course, it's about intelligently processing the food. You mentioned a few times the idea of fermentation. One of the key essential processes of how we process our food and make it more digestible and bring more nutrients in, make it more living and digestible for our bodies.
Bioavailability. So what would you recommend? I mean, I pretty much cycle activated charcoal, 3 or 4 times, every 3 or 4 days, I might add a little bit, some milk thistle, things of that nature, dabble in a little bit of the, sort of higher levels, because let's be honest, Roundup is in everything. And I don't care whether it's someone, unless you have a direct source of fruit from the land and you're still buying something that is represented as organic, that's bullshit. Sorry. I mean, it's just not organic. It's the energetic. If you can see auras the way I do, I can see the auric field of it, and it is not the highest potential. That means that there are other things that are fortified within that offering. And so to mitigate it, you need these things. So you mentioned clay. What would you recommend to the audience as a form of that to help balance and create homeostasis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a great one would be an example of like bentonite clay. It's very kind of common, ubiquitous, a term maybe somebody's heard, but one doesn't need to limit themselves to that. It can literally be any type of clay. You can get, cosmetic clays. I would obviously just make sure that, it's kind of mineral content, maybe where it's being sourced is, checks out and is clean. But yeah, bentonite clay is as an example. And I think charcoal is a really good one. And I don't think it's one of those things someone needs to take every single day. Maybe in the beginning as part of like a focused kind of, detox protocol, or if you're in a certain area or a certain occupation where you might have a higher level of exposure. But you're absolutely right. I mean, glyphosate, it's everywhere. It's got the half-life of, I can't remember what it is. It's water soluble. It's like
half-life of like 30,000 years or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, not to mention what they're doing to our skies, with the chemtrails dropping aluminum and these types of things, and just even exhaust, from vehicles. And actually one of the more polluting aspects of vehicles is actually, the rubber and the tire brakes and all this kind of everything else that comes off our vehicles. So yeah, we don't live in a pristine world and environment. And even if we did, we were still consuming, charcoal and clays. So that's where, again, that kind of intuitiveness, I always hesitate to play that role of kind of prescription of like, all right, take this, X times number of day, da, 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 da. I don't know. I mean, I don't know your situation. And I'm saying that generally. This is where, we need to be our own nutritionists. We need to be our own herbalists. We need to be our own healers. There's always a time and a place for outside reference and influence and guidance, 100%. But ultimately, foundationally, it begins and ends with us and our own ability to, tune in to ourselves.
So the whole salt thing, which is a bit of a myth, but yet, if you're subject to, looking down the barrel of insulin resistance, which is probably 90% of Western world eating consumption. I mean, people don't even understand it. I'm going out to a 5-star meal. I'm spending $500 on my wife and I celebrating Mother's Day. You're literally paying $500 for someone to poison you. Yeah. You're literally having that expensive, T-bone that you paid like $200 for, and they're probably smothering it. in seed oil. And then
Yeah.
you're getting a salad with seed oil, and you get all this stuff, and like you're like, oh, and you know, this is part of the part that I think is really interesting. The science in of itself, this need to create a man-made drug to combat something that is the intelligence that is ancient, and oh, there's something better. Ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen and ladies, why is it that every single conducted experiment in determining whether a drug is going to satisfy a profile or have some effect where it has anything greater than what they always compare it to? What is it, ladies and gentlemen? The placebo. Let me see, what is that? That's called your mind. And I always remind people, you are the most powerful tuning fork of knowing. It's like your truth is the only truth you need to be concerned with, because it really means nothing. Whatever Malcolm says, whatever I say, whatever you believe is what's going to be materialized and created in your reality. So you could read all this stuff, listen to all the stuff we're saying, all this kind of stuff, but you really have this deeper seated construct within your unconscious that you're not even aware of. And that's why it's always good to go deeper as a seeker, to go deeper into understanding these layers. Within Taoism, we have conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. And when you meet in the middle of those two, the versica, which is the center point, the Wu Ji, the stillness, and that's where things cross over. And this happens in all indigenous practices. You have things that within Taoism, it's yin and yang. Within the yogi path, it's Shiva and Shakti. These are they meet in the middle for the knowing of all knowings, the center point of the center point of the center point. And so, you know, this stuff is like comes right back to you. So I see this all the time. People come to me, they have a disease, whatever it is. Both of them have the same disease. Two people, I've got cancer of this, I've got cancer of that. And the same answer, I'm going to beat it. I'm going to beat it. One person's dead in 6 months. The other one isn't. Why is that? Mm-hmm. Because they actually believe what they were saying.
Right.
And so you know, there is a ritual that we do within Taoism to imprint, and I imprint things all the time. I can change the construct of anything instantly, right down to a subatomic particle, and it will be evident. It'll be self-evident. You will experience the visceral experience. You'll experience the energetic charge. You'll experience there's this pulpability and weight to this thing that is not of this world, and it doesn't get altered. You can put it down, walk away. Oh, I had a conversation with San, and come back the next day, and it's like, holy shit, it's still there, because it's forever altered. That's the power of attention, intention, changing the construct. And so this is something that we have intuitively in our control system. And so now we get down to the food, we get down to the salt, we get down to, you reference it used to be vegetarian, vegan, plant-based. You're now sort of like coming to a realization that maybe you've been like that for a long time, where there's a density that comes, or a substance that if I take a little bit here and there, it just makes me whole. It's just what I need.
Totally.
So right back to the intuitive stuff you're talking about. This is what grounds me, that makes it whole for me. And when you take on a plant life or a lifestyle, it can be problematic, in my opinion. That's just my observation, that you can become very deficient in many things because you're consuming things that are literally extracting the nutrients from your body, and you're not being able to balance it and put it back in, because, you know, it's the instinct of the plant to survive. And with that, consuming it has all good intensive purposes, yet if you're not able to unlock its potential, it becomes problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, you know, coming back to those, you know, 4 core food groups, you know, fermentation is one of them. That's the bacterial kingdom, utilizing bacteria and fungus, you know, to basically pre-digest, break down, release nutrients, optimize the food you're about to consume. Every single culture around the world ferments its own food. Again, except our modern standard American culture, where, you know, it's like, well, to the advent of, you know, pasteurization or our industrial, you know, supply chains, where we can literally have access to any food 24/7, 365. Yeah, we don't need to do that fermentation thing, right? Like, whoops. And, you know, the pendulum is swinging back, where we're now realizing the role that it played. So that's one of the key foundational for food groups is ferments, fungi, and that is something that represents not only single cell yeast, you know, that play a role in fermentation, all the way up to what some might call like the kind of medicinal, the noble polypores, and, you know, every kind of fungus and mushroom in between. Mushrooms are just the reproductive portion of certain fungi. It's like the apple on the tree, that little button mushroom that pops out of the ground. It's the organism that's underneath that pushes that out as it's in its reproductive cycle. So, you know, yes, fungi, mushrooms, kind of a key food group and kingdom that blurs that line between food and medicine. Some of them we're just eating purely for nutrients, for calories, for vitamins, for minerals. And then there's others we're going to consume by way of fermentation, having its effect on other foods that we're eating, plants or animal based. But then also the idea of consuming fungi, you know, medicinally. You know, the advent of penicillin, right? Where did that come from? It came from what's known as like vulgar knowledge or folk knowledge, folk wisdom. It was Alexander Fleming that looked at people that had a tradition of consuming, you know, that little like blue stuff, the mold that, you know, you can find on bread and on citrus, like, you know, applying that to wounds. That was a kind of a common folk knowledge. Is like, what's going on there? That led to the advent of antibiotics and penicillin. That whole breakthrough, it had its traditional cultural origins. So very key, very essential and foundational. Then the other two, where we're really going to get more of our macronutrients from, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. And you can be plant-based, you can be animal-based, whatever, but you need to consume foods from each of those four kingdoms because they offer something in, you know, nutrients and like as you said, like qualitative substance that the others don't. Like, we're not herbivores. I know that might sound a bit of a shock, but you know, myself included, people like to experiment. We try it out because we get into this kind of philosophy, either from kind of an ecological frame of point of view, or from kind of a personal health point of view, or kind of a non-harming, you know, non-cruelty type of mentality. But it's just not real. It's just not, you know, who we are and our role in this life. So animal foods play an important role. And, you know, even though I grew up eating animal foods, it wasn't until I was an adult that I actually learned, you know, properly how, you know, which animal foods to consume and how to consume them. Again, leaning on traditional wisdom. It's, you know, we need to access the bones and the marrow and, you know, eat meat in the tendons, like right off of a bone, and creating bone broths. We need to consume the organs, the most concentrated parts of the animal, as well as the muscle meat, as well as the skin, as well as, you know, every single element and aspect, and from animals that have been raised, you know, respectfully. This idea of animal husbandry, right? That's an old terminology, just like, you know, a wife, to be a midwife, to be a, that denoted an occupation, right? Like, it was the alewives who were, you know, the herbalists that were brewing the beer, just like it was midwives who were helping, you know, that transition of birth. So animal husbandry, to be a good steward, to literally husband animals and care for them and raise them properly, versus, again, you know, kind of our industrialized approach, which is all about scale, and we go way off track. So we're consuming animals that have, you know, haven't been treated well, that have been fed the wrong diet. And then what we do with them, you know, like selectively remove parts, or, you know, overly process or unintelligently process those foods, and we expect health. And when we don't get it, we're like, well, okay, animal foods are all bad. You know, it's about intelligent eating. And the plant kingdom, where I've landed with it now, instead of trying to get 100% of my calories from that particular food group, I love plants, but I see the main role that they play in my diet is there's an element of, like you say, certain staples like rice. I'm not an anti, I'm not, because you can see a lot of people now, they're like carnivore, like we're not designed to eat plants. I'm like, yeah, that sounds like another experiment to me, actually. And you're going to find out fairly soon, one way or another, that, that only lasts so long. Plants really, truly play a role. And I think they especially play a role, not only when in feeding ourselves, if they're intelligently processed, eaten in a correct way, but also as medicine. Right. And this is where I'm a big believer in herbs and herbalism, which a friend of mine redefined. He says, you know what, herbalism is nothing more than the institutionalization of wild food intuition, right? Like knowing what plants are and the effect, the role that they can play in our body. I don't know if you saw it a couple of weeks ago. It was all over the news. I got sent it several times by people in my network. They're like, and you read the article. It was like, first time, it was about an orangutan, that had this kind of wound on its face. And it was, wow, first time that an animal's been observed to gather a medicinal plant. And it was so fascinating that it knew that this plant, and it chewed it up, and it didn't swallow it. It took it and it put it on the wound, and it healed it within 7 days. I mean, this is just so miraculous. I'm like, really? Is that actually miraculous? Like that, is this so novel, or is this actually natural? It's like, is there some sort of innate intelligence, even in animals, that knows how to care for oneself and one's body?
Yeah. I mean, that's the intuitive realization that you sense that. But the sensory perception, which goes in a category within the stuff that I teach people for over 30 years, is part of the Taoist seeker, the practitioner. It comes in that form: clairvoyance, manifestation, magic, which is a much deeper construction of that energetic potential from all elements, environmental, internalized, externalized. It's probably the exoteric like realization, yet it has to be self-evident. So this comes right back to, understanding how your body is responding, and less is more is always the first course of proactivity for any seeker to want to optimize their health, is to slowly navigate through this, seemingly impossible task of identifying what is good and what is bad for you. And that will come by how you're feeling. And so, I think a lot of these people, carnivore exclusively, will realize they've burnt their candle at both ends, and the self-evidence will be mortality. And so this is sort of like part of what takes place. You want endurance. Most people that have survived the paleo mind control, or more commonly MK Ultra version of food consumption, which is a 3-letter organization that developed a mind control program back in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, that's another story. But basically, what you're doing is the reason that paleo was so successful for the few that actually observed the processes is there was a huge dose of dark leafy greens, i.e. spinach and things of that nature, that people would eat with their meat. And that was a huge component and to the consumption of their food, which balanced everything out and gave them a very positive result. But when you find people that are eating paleo and they're like, I ditched the vegetables, I'm just eating the meat, that becomes problematic. And it becomes self-evident in the result itself. And they're the ones that end up failing at achieving the goals that they're looking at, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. There needs to be this balance and understanding what is the most appropriate value, and omnivore would be more apparent on a daily basis as you go through your seeking the knowledge of your true self, that this would be apparent because your body will respond to it, instantaneously. And
And cool. And, like for a long time, I was into yoga, and that led me partly, down the vegetarian path. And, in yoga, it's all about attaining these high states, right? Of like omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence. And then, wait a minute, I was like, wait a minute, omnivore, right? It's the highest state of eating.
Right. There are no coincidences. That messaging comes very clearly.
Yeah.
So you've gone through this journey collectively through your lifetime, and now you've created an offering within the scope of digital offerings that are giving people more insight into their conscious seeking of optimal health. So let's speak a little bit about that. What is it that you've created?
Okay, right on. Yeah. So the main expression, it's a business called Light Cellar, which is LIGHTCELLAR, and that speaks to, you know, the source of energy, of life. You mentioned it, like sun, light. We are light beings. And then the cellar part kind of speaks to that more kind of traditional way of being. Like people always had a cellar of foods versus there's that phrase, we're only 3 days away from chaos, from anarchy. When the trucks stop rolling and the grocery stores are empty, your ancestors never would have dreamt of being not having a food store for any number of reasons. And so that's kind of where the name comes from, just a little bit of play on that. And the whole purpose, the whole mission is to help others learn how to find and craft their own food and medicine, taking an active role back into really sourcing ingredients well. We're quite known for having things that are unique or hard to find. I mean, everything is super high quality. We got very high standards. Like we don't do seed oils, we only do high quality salts, that type of thing. So it has a kind of a store element where we provide a lot of this herbs, medicinal mushrooms. We've got very well chosen, very small selective supplements, but most of it is just primarily natural foods and ingredients. We have a little kind of cafe, Elixir bar, where people come locally. We're here in the northwest of Calgary. And then we also have a production kitchen. So we're making ferments. We make natto in-house. We make sauerkraut. We do fermented hot sauces and different condiments, just again, to kind of allow access to these live, living, cultured foods, but also just inspire ideas. So we have a teaching kitchen as well, where folks can come, again, if they're local, learn how to ferment their own food or learn how to be your own herbalist. We'll take people out on plant walks. And then everything also does have an online element. And, we've got customers in the States, but also all across Canada to be able to access those foods, but also the education and the learning. So, foraging might not be able to take you directly out to the forest, but I do something called the Foraging Forecast, which, is like a database of, medicinal plants and herbs, over the last few years, one of our top requests, like people got onto the idea of pine, during COVID. And it was like, we get all these calls. You're like, do you guys sell pine needle tea? And we'd be like, no, but have you looked outside? I bet you down somewhere along your street, you will find a pine tree. So just like fundamental, it's just like, what is growing around us? Like, how can we open our eyes to the potential of what is all around us? So, that's available. We have lots of free courses online going, deeper into what I call that ancestral food guide that we covered off, or the intelligent eating, intuitive eating. And then there's some paid stuff in terms of how to ferment or how to do traditional broths and stocks, that type of thing. So it's lightcellar.ca. That's the website. You can find me on some social media as well. Just look up Light Cellar on YouTube, or Instagram is kind of a main channel that we put a lot out through there. And if anybody's interested, love to continue on the journey.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I want all the OGs, all my students, all the OGs of the channel, the Way 126 experience, to get out there and explore Malcolm's offering in all aspects. You got a new customer here. I'll start getting this stuff shipped in from Canada, eh?
There we are.
America, absolutely. In closing, I want to say, I want to ask you one last question. What is your definition of consciousness?
Oh, Okay, well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is you know, be present in that awareness of life and everything that's unfolding. We talked a lot about kind of that intuition, that kind of internal knowing, and it's obviously it's very deep. You know, we can have kind of more of a more shallow level of awareness, consciousness, but you know, how deep can we take it? How much to the depths can we go? And I think that is ultimately the kind of challenge of life, to be able to have enough consciousness that you can actively participate and even just purely marvel in, you know, the phenomenon of the physical body, all the way down to, you know, truly participating. I've got two children, and it's always a challenge for me to like, just that reminder of like, wow, take this in, you know, like this is the moment. This is why we do everything or anything, is to be as present as we can, to be as conscious as we can in that moment, because that's all we have, right?
Amen to that, brother. That was amazing. Very beautiful. Never heard the same answer from anyone, and I love it. I love it. That's what this journey for the seeker is, to realize this present moment is all we have.
Yeah, right on.
With that, in closing, I want to thank you for sharing your time with us today on the channel, my friend. Very grateful for your mastery and insight and your offering. And not only will I take advantage of it, so will many of the viewers. So this is a very exciting time. I want to thank you for sharing your time with us today. I want to thank the universe for bringing you into my life. I want to thank the audience for sharing their time with us today. And I am your humble servant and seafood Taoist Master San Qing. And I'll see you in the next one, guys.
Right on.